This is the story of Margaret, a 70-year-old grandmother who died, but only for a moment. What she experienced during those fleeting moments will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. Margaret claimed she met Jesus and was shown extraordinary visions of the future, including events in 2025 that are both awe-inspiring and terrifying. From America's transformation to a surprising moment involving Russia, her story is unlike anything you've heard before. Now, Margaret has returned with a message that could change the way we think about our lives and the world we live in. Margaret's day began like so many others. She was baking cookies in her small Minnesota kitchen, humming to herself as the scent of cinnamon filled the air. Her grandchildren were due to visit later that day, and she wanted everything to be perfect. At 70, Margaret prided herself on her energy and her ability to keep up with her busy family. But that morning, something felt different. As she bent down to take a tray of cookies out of the oven, a sharp pain shot through her chest. Margaret gasped, clutching the counter for support. The world around her seemed to blur, the colors and sounds fading into a strange, muted haze. She tried to call out, but her voice wouldn't come. The last thing Margaret remembered was collapsing onto the kitchen floor, the faint sound of her phone ringing somewhere in the background. Her vision went dark, and the pain disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming stillness. She later learned that her daughter, worried when Margaret didn't answer her calls, had rushed over and found her unconscious. The paramedics worked frantically to revive her, but for several minutes, Margaret's heart had stopped. In those minutes, Margaret experienced something extraordinary. The first thing Margaret noticed was the light. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but warm and inviting, like the golden glow of a sunset. She found herself standing in what seemed to be an endless meadow, the air filled with a peace she had never felt before. The colors were vivid, almost alive, with flowers that seemed to hum softly as they swayed in the breeze. At first, Margaret thought she was dreaming. She looked down at her hands and feet, expecting to see the frail body she had grown accustomed to over the years. But instead, she felt weightless, free of the aches and limitations that had come with age. As she walked through the meadow, she became aware of a presence. It wasn't something she saw, but something she felt, an overwhelming sense of love and acceptance. Margaret felt as though she were being gently drawn forward, guided by an invisible hand. She didn't know where she was going, but she trusted it completely. As she moved closer to the source of the light, Margaret began to hear a voice, not with her ears, but in her soul. It was calm, steady, and filled with a kindness that brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome, Margaret," the voice said. "There is something I want to show you." Standing before Margaret was a figure she instinctively knew was Jesus. He wasn't as she had seen him depicted in paintings and statues. His presence was more radiant, more real, and yet deeply familiar. His eyes held a depth of understanding that made Margaret feel completely seen, yet completely loved. Margaret wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but no words came. She didn't need to. Jesus smiled, as if he already knew everything she wanted to say. "You have lived a good life, Margaret," he said, "but there is more for you to understand." Jesus extended his hand, and Margaret hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The warmth that radiated from his touch was indescribable, filling her with a sense of belonging and purpose. "I want to show you what is to come," Jesus said, "so that you can return and share it with the world." With that, the meadow around them began to shift and change. The light grew brighter, and Margaret felt herself being lifted, as though she were floating above the earth. What she saw next left her in awe. Margaret found herself looking down at a bustling cityscape, but it wasn't like any city she had seen before. It was vibrant, alive with activity, yet there was an underlying calmness that felt almost otherworldly. Jesus began to narrate, explaining that this was America in 2025, a nation at a crossroads. She saw people working together in ways she hadn't imagined possible. Neighbors of different backgrounds were collaborating on community projects, planting gardens, and building homes for those in need. The divisions that had once seemed insurmountable were slowly dissolving, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. But not everything was perfect. Margaret also saw glimpses of challenges, natural disasters, political debates, and moments of uncertainty. Yet, even in the face of adversity, there was hope. Jesus pointed to a group of people praying together in a park. Their hands joined as they asked for guidance and strength. Margaret's heart swelled with pride and longing. She wanted to stay and watch, to see how it all unfolded. But Jesus turned to her and said, "There is more you must see." The scene shifted, and Margaret found herself standing in what appeared to be a small town square. The American flag fluttered in the breeze, and a crowd had gathered to listen to a speaker on a makeshift stage. It was the newly elected president, a figure who exuded both strength and humility. Jesus explained that the 2024 election had been a turning point for the nation. The president's message was one of unity, urging Americans to look beyond their differences and focus on what they shared. Margaret saw people nodding, some with tears in their eyes, as the president spoke of rebuilding trust, fostering compassion, and addressing the nation's most pressing challenges. Margaret also saw the impact of these words. Communities were coming together, driven not by fear, but by hope. Schools were becoming hubs of connection, teaching not just academics, but values like kindness and respect. Small businesses were thriving, supported by policies that prioritized local economies. Yet, Jesus reminded Margaret that this progress was fragile. "It takes effort," he said. "Love must be chosen again and again." Margaret found herself in a small suburban neighborhood, a place that looked both familiar and new. She saw neighbors gathered in front yards, their voices filled with warmth and laughter as they worked together to plant a community garden. Jesus explained that in 2025, a significant movement was unfolding. People were rediscovering the power of connection. Margaret was shown moments where individuals chose collaboration over conflict. A family welcomed new immigrants into their community, offering them a place to stay until they got on their feet. In another scene, two people who had been on opposite sides of a heated political divide sat down over coffee to talk, not to argue, but to understand each other's perspectives. There were also larger-scale efforts. Margaret saw towns organizing cleanup projects after storms, with people of all ages pitching in. Churches, mosques, and synagogues opened their doors to host interfaith dialogues, building bridges between communities that had once been distant. Jesus reminded Margaret, "Healing begins in the heart and spreads outward. Trust is not given. It is earned through actions that show love and respect." Margaret was deeply moved by the scenes of ordinary people making extraordinary efforts to heal their communities. She realized that true unity didn't come from grand gestures, but from the daily decisions to treat others with kindness and dignity. The scene shifted again, and Margaret saw a bustling farmer's market. Stalls were filled with fresh produce, handmade goods, and families enjoying the vibrant atmosphere. Jesus explained that the economy in 2025 had begun to transform, driven by innovation, sustainability, and local empowerment. Margaret was shown a young entrepreneur who had started a business repurposing old materials into affordable furniture. His work not only provided jobs but also reduced waste. She saw farmers using renewable energy to power their equipment and small towns thriving as people invested in local businesses instead of large corporations. Margaret noticed something remarkable. People seemed happier. They weren't just working for survival, they were working with purpose. Jesus pointed out a factory where employees were treated with respect and given opportunities to grow. "The economy thrives when people are valued," he said. Margaret also saw advances in technology being used for good. Small towns that had once been overlooked were now connected to larger markets through digital platforms, allowing them to compete and flourish. It was a vision of an economy that served people, not the other way around. Next, Margaret found herself standing in the middle of a forest. Sunlight streamed through the trees, and birds chirped overhead. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of wildflowers and moss. Jesus explained that in 2025, humanity was taking serious steps to restore the earth. Margaret saw cities adopting green energy solutions like solar panels and wind turbines. Skyscrapers were adorned with vertical gardens, and public transportation systems ran on clean energy. She saw rivers once polluted now flowing clear, thanks to community cleanup efforts and stricter environmental policies. In rural areas, farmers were using regenerative practices to heal the soil and increase crop yields without harming the planet. Margaret watched as children planted trees during a school project, their laughter filling the air as they contributed to a global reforestation movement. One of the most moving moments was seeing a group of volunteers rescuing sea turtles caught in plastic waste. Their dedication reminded Margaret of the profound impact individuals could have when they work together for a common cause. Jesus turned to Margaret and said, "Creation was given as a gift. It is their responsibility to nurture it for future generations." Margaret's next vision was of a church, not a traditional one, but an open field where people of all faiths had gathered. They were singing, praying, and sharing stories, their differences melting away in the presence of love and unity. Jesus explained that in 2025, a spiritual awakening was spreading across the world. Margaret saw people turning back to faith, not in a rigid or judgmental way, but as a source of hope and inspiration. Churches, mosques, and temples were filled, not because people felt obligated to attend, but because they wanted to reconnect with something greater than themselves. She also saw a rise in interfaith collaboration. In one scene, religious leaders from different traditions stood together at a food drive, working side by side to feed the hungry. In another, a group of young people gathered for a meditation session, their focus on inner peace and compassion for others. Jesus emphasized that this awakening wasn't about any one religion. It's about love, he said. Faith should bring people together, not drive them apart. The light around Margaret shifted again, and she found herself looking at a map of the world. Jesus began to show her scenes from different countries, each one working together in ways she had never thought possible. In one scene, she saw leaders from America and Russia sitting at a long table, signing an agreement that would reduce global tensions and promote peace. Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched the leaders shake hands, their expressions filled with determination and hope. She saw nations collaborating on environmental initiatives, pooling resources to combat climate change and restore ecosystems. In another vision, scientists from multiple countries worked together to develop new technologies that provided clean drinking water to communities in need. What struck Margaret most was the sense of shared humanity. The divisions between nations seemed to blur as people focused on common goals. "This is the future I want for them," Jesus said, "but it requires courage, compassion, and a willingness to put aside pride." Margaret's vision shifted once more, and she found herself inside a warm, cozy living room. A family sat together on the couch, laughing and talking as they played a board game. Jesus explained that in 2025, families were rediscovering the importance of connection. Margaret saw scenes of grandparents teaching grandchildren how to bake, parents reading bedtime stories, and siblings working together on school projects. It wasn't just about spending time together, it was about truly being present. Phones and distractions were set aside as families prioritized their relationships. One moment stood out vividly: a teenage boy helping his elderly grandmother learn how to use a new piece of technology. Margaret saw the joy in the grandmother's eyes as she connected with distant relatives over video calls. It reminded Margaret of her own family and how small gestures of love could bridge even the widest gaps. Jesus explained that these connections were the foundation of the renewed communities Margaret had seen earlier. "Strong families create strong societies," he said. "When love begins at home, it spreads outward." Margaret felt a pang of longing to return to her own family, but she also felt inspired by the beauty of what she had witnessed. It was a reminder that no matter how busy life became, family was worth every moment of effort. The scene shifted to a place Margaret recognized from news reports: Moscow, Russia. The streets were bustling with people, but the atmosphere wasn't tense or hostile. Instead, there was a sense of celebration in the air. Jesus explained that in 2025, a significant event in Russia had marked a turning point for global peace. Margaret saw images of peaceful demonstrations, led by young people demanding change. Their signs didn't call for conflict, but for unity and progress. The movement gained momentum, inspiring leaders to adopt new policies that emphasize collaboration rather than competition. One moment in the vision stood out: a historic agreement between Russia and several other nations, including the United States. The agreement focused on reducing nuclear arsenals, addressing climate change, and fostering cultural exchange programs. Margaret saw students from Russia visiting American schools, sharing their experiences, and learning from one another. Jesus explained, "The seeds of peace are often sown in the hearts of the young. When leaders listen to their people, nations grow stronger together." Despite the hopeful visions, Jesus showed Margaret that 2025 wasn't without its challenges. She saw communities struggling with the lingering effects of past divisions, mistrust, economic disparities, and environmental damage. Progress was being made, but it wasn't easy. Margaret was shown a small town recovering from a devastating flood. The residents worked tirelessly to rebuild, but the strain of limited resources tested their patience and resolve. Jesus explained that even in times of progress, hardship would continue to test humanity's strength. She also saw political debates where tempers flared and voices were raised. Margaret felt a pang of frustration as she watched people talk past one another, unwilling to listen. Yet in these moments, she also saw glimmers of hope, individuals stepping forward to mediate, finding common ground where it seemed impossible. "The path to healing is never straight," Jesus said, "but every effort to move forward brings them closer to the world I envisioned." Margaret realized that while challenges would always exist, the human spirit's resilience was what mattered most. It was the determination to keep going, even when the road seemed hard, that defined true progress. As Margaret's vision continued, Jesus showed her moments that seemed small but carried immense weight. She saw acts of kindness that transformed lives, people helping strangers, communities rallying around those in need, and families opening their homes to the homeless. One powerful image showed a young boy giving his lunch to a classmate who had none. The classmate's gratitude was evident, and Margaret could feel the ripple effect of that simple act. Jesus explained that these moments, though seemingly insignificant, created waves of change that touched countless lives. "These are the miracles of love and faith," Jesus said. "They happen every day, but only those who look with open hearts can see them." Margaret felt a profound sense of awe as she realized that miracles weren't just grand, supernatural events. They were the result of love in action, people choosing to care for one another, even when it was inconvenient or difficult. Jesus turned to Margaret and spoke directly to her heart. His voice was calm yet powerful, each word resonating deeply within her soul. "Margaret," he said, "you have seen what is possible. Now, it is your responsibility to share this vision with the world." Margaret felt a surge of emotion. She wanted to stay in this place of peace and love, but she knew her time wasn't finished. Jesus continued, "The future is not fixed. It is shaped by the choices they make every day. Tell them to choose love, to seek understanding, and to work together for a better tomorrow." Jesus placed his hand on Margaret's shoulder, filling her with a warmth that seemed to banish all fear and doubt. "You are not alone," he said. "I am with you always." As the light around her began to fade, Margaret felt a deep sense of purpose. She didn't know how she would share what she had seen, but she knew she had to try. Margaret's next awareness was of cold air and faint voices. She opened her eyes to find herself surrounded by paramedics and her daughter, who was clutching her hand. tears streaming down her face. "Mom, you're back," her daughter exclaimed, her voice a mix of relief and disbelief. Margaret's body ached, and she felt the weight of her physical form again, but her heart was filled with an unshakable sense of purpose. She had just experienced something extraordinary, and though she couldn't yet find the words to explain it, she knew it was something she had to share. Margaret didn't waste time. As soon as she regained her strength, she began sharing her experience with her family. At first, her words were met with skepticism. "Mom, it must have been a dream," her daughter said gently. But Margaret's sincerity and the detail of her account made it impossible to dismiss. Word of Margaret's story spread quickly. Neighbors, church members, and even local reporters came to hear her testimony. Margaret spoke not with the urgency of someone seeking attention, but with the calm conviction of someone who had seen the truth. Her message was clear. The future is not set in stone. It is shaped by our choices, our love, and our willingness to work together. What I saw was a world that could be better, but only if we make it so. Margaret's story inspired people in ways she hadn't expected. Community members began organizing cleanup drives, hosting interfaith gatherings, and supporting local businesses. Small acts of kindness multiplied, creating ripples of change throughout her town. One of the key lessons Margaret shared was the importance of choice. She often repeated the words Jesus had spoken to her: "Love must be chosen," again and again. Margaret explained that every decision, no matter how small, had the power to shape the future. She recounted how, in her vision, simple acts, like a young boy sharing his lunch or neighbors planting a garden together, had profound effects. "It's not about waiting for someone else to fix the world," Margaret said. "It's about doing what you can, where you are, with what you have." Margaret also spoke about the power of forgiveness. In her vision, she had seen families reconciling, communities healing old wounds, and nations finding common ground. She encouraged her listeners to let go of grudges and focus on building bridges instead of walls. Her words resonated deeply, inspiring people to take ownership of their actions. Whether it was mending a broken relationship, volunteering at a shelter, or simply treating others with kindness, Margaret's message reminded everyone that change starts with the individual. Margaret's story reached beyond her small town, eventually gaining attention from people across the country and even around the world. Her vision of global unity struck a chord in a world still grappling with division and uncertainty. She spoke about the pivotal moment she had seen in Russia, a peaceful revolution that inspired collaboration between nations. Margaret described the historic agreement she had witnessed, emphasizing how it symbolized the possibility of reconciliation and progress on a global scale. Margaret also shared her vision of countries working together to combat climate change, end hunger, and develop technologies that served humanity rather than exploiting it. "We are stronger together," she would say. "When we choose unity over division, we create a future where everyone can thrive." Her story became a beacon of hope, reminding people that even in the face of challenges, there was always a path forward. Margaret's unwavering faith in humanity's ability to rise above its differences inspired countless individuals to believe in a better tomorrow. Margaret often ended her talks with a heartfelt plea to her audience. "What I saw wasn't just a vision of what could be. It was a call to action. We have the power to create a brighter tomorrow. But it starts with us, here and now." She urged people to embrace love, compassion, and understanding in their daily lives. "The world I saw in 2025 wasn't perfect," she would say, "but it was filled with hope, and hope is the foundation on which we build everything else." Margaret's journey reminded her listeners that the future wasn't predetermined. It was shaped by the choices they made each day, choices to care for the planet, to support one another, and to strive for unity despite their differences. As Margaret spoke, her voice carried the weight of her experience and the light of her conviction. She didn't just share her story, she invited others to become part of it, to carry forward the vision of a world transformed by love. And as she looked out at her audience, Margaret saw the beginnings of that transformation. In the faces of those listening, she saw hope, determination, and the seeds of a brighter tomorrow.